listening to Hungry for More, an Epicurean's Dilemma. I'm your host, Trish Close, and I'm coming at you from my kitchen. On today's menu, it's Todd Schulkin. He's the executive director of the Julia Child Foundation. I learned so much about this incredible organization. It started in 1995, really as a way to expand Julia Child's impact as a teacher and a mentor. That was really important to her. Through grants, it really does continue her legacy, educating and encouraging others to live well through the joys of cooking, eating, and drinking well. We also chatted a little bit about the podcast that Todd hosts, and he always asks his guests about their Julia moment. So, of course, I had to ask him his Julia moment, and he'll share that. And we learned about his life as a talent agent in Hollywood, pretty fascinating, and his journey to the foundation. Here's Todd Schulkin. Todd Shulkin, thank you for being here today, joining from London, right?
That's right. It's a pleasure to join you.
Okay, you are the executive director of the Julia Child Foundation, among so many other things. Also a former talent agent, is that correct?
I am, yes, I was a talent agent, but I still, in addition to what I do for the foundation, I'm still a literary manager, which is very similar. And so I continue to work with writers and directors. Originally, I was a film agent. That's how I trained. So I wear a lot of hats, and even the work with the foundation, often I'm wearing two hats at the same time, I think you could say.
Yeah, I know how that goes for sure. Fascinating career. I am really excited to talk to you about that. But first, where are you from originally, Todd?
Oh, I find that question challenging because I'm not from anywhere originally, and I'll try to explain why concisely.
Okay.
I'm a native Californian, raised in the Midwest by New Yorkers.
Okay, I like that. So, but you, I mean, is there a place that you would consider home?
Well, I would say Kansas City is my hometown because that's where I was raised from the time I was 4 until I went off to college, and my family lived there for a really long time. And, I feel roots there, but there's, a certain difference in that my parents aren't from there. They didn't stay. I don't have any family members there anymore. And my parents were very much New Yorkers, but with this connection to California. And then they've gone back to California. I was born in the Bay Area. And then I lived in California for 2 different stints for a total of at least 15 years. So in some ways, as an adult, I kind of consider Los Angeles home.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. And for school, I mean, where did you go to school then, I guess? That early childhood school time?
Well, I went to Montessori in the Bay Area, and then I went to primary school and secondary school at a private school in Kansas City,
okay,
which was originally called the Pembroke Country Day School. It's now called Pembroke Hill. It merged with the girls' school, but it's still part of this Country Day school tradition and ethos that there are Country Day schools in, more than a dozen cities in the U.S.
Okay, so New Yorker parents.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Define that for me. What is, just to the nth degree?
Well, my parents are 3rd generation New Yorkers who were born and raised there. And so my mother still, my parents haven't lived in New York for more than 50 years. And people will still be like, are you from New York? My mom still has an accent, I don't think she really likes this, but I'm like, she sounds just like Donald Trump. He grew up a town next to her. So, yeah, I used to say when Donald Trump would start ranting, he would sound like my old Jewish aunts, who because it's the same way of talking and communicating. My mom doesn't rant, but she still says things like stereo and, pronounces words funny. But then she also uses certain Midwestern pronunciations because she lived there for so long.
Was food important for you all growing up in your house?
No, my parents are uninterested in food. They have many intellectual interests, but food is not one of them. My mom does not like to cook. Although for someone who doesn't like to cook, she makes an effort and does cook on a regular basis. And I think I did grow up eating food that was made at home. My mom just found it a chore and didn't have sort of any training. And I also say there's an irony. My father's parents owned a restaurant on Long Island for a long time, but they weren't interested in food. It was just a job they could do. And my dad even worked in it, but it's just like none of them are interested. So I'm sort of the example of the person who, from deprivation, ended up being very interested in it. That's how I describe it.
Right. But you are very interested in food.
Yes, I am. And what's interesting is I was a picky eater as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
and that was always, frowned upon. Although I realize now as a parent, my mother was incredibly patient and tried really hard to cater to my demands.
That's nice.
Which I wouldn't do as a parent as much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think some of that was that I had, sensitive taste buds. And now that I've learned what certain foods should taste like and seasonal eating and all of that, it really changed my life. And actually, when I went to university, it was a place that also had terrible food.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really trained to cook for myself when I got there. And I studied abroad in Italy this second part of my junior year. And that was sort of the epiphany, because this was Italy in the early 1990s. So before internet, and you were fully immersed in the culture, and I had to cook for myself. But of course, what a great place in Florence to do that. And the food was great. And I took a cooking class, actually from an American expat who's now back in the States, but was offering classes there. And that was the kind of transformative moment of discovering food and being interested in it and realizing what, particularly certain vegetables should or can taste like.
Isn't it amazing because I think that happened to me too. I enjoyed cooking, but very early on, I think in my 20s, I got hooked and I just couldn't almost get enough. I wanted to learn as much as I could about cooking and techniques and how to prepare certain foods and different foods. But yeah, I feel like it almost bites you if you're into that kind of thing. And then you just take off from there.
Well, and then I was lucky because one of my friends, who's now my wife, was from a very foodie family, and she's my Julia connection originally. And so then I ended up entering this, completely immersive world of both people very interested, if not obsessed with food, who regularly prioritized fine dining as an experience. And, my mother-in-law is a esteemed cooking teacher, and you can't be around someone like that and not learn. So that just was like, an even greater and now almost lifelong immersion.
I like it. Our college cafeteria was called the Dining Commons. I'm sure that's probably what they're called all over the place. We referred to it as the Dining Commons, the DC. It was.
Well, where I went, it was actually, and I think it's still called the Ratty for very.
No, that's a terrible name.
Well, it was a terrible place. It was terrible food. It was ugly as hell. And it's shocking to me that it still exists as a building that's utilized. And I just, it was a notoriously bad experience that hopefully I'm told has evolved and has changed dramatically, although it looks the same. I was there a few years ago.
Picky eater. I was a picky eater as well, but I also, on my plate, none of the food could touch each other. So if it was mashed potatoes and peas, the peas and the mashed potatoes could not touch each other, or I couldn't eat it.
I was not hyper about that, but there were just certain things, like I would not eat tomatoes or tomato sauce until I was an adult. Even now when I eat them, my mom's eyes are like, wow. And I'll tell you something really gross. What I ate instead was, everyone else had spaghetti with tomato sauce on it, and I had spaghetti with warmed up ketchup on it.
No.
Which of course I would not eat now, but that was all I would eat. And then I would not eat salad if it had like all different kinds of ingredients, which of course now is like the best kind of salad. I just wanted plain lettuce, and I had like 2 or 3 dressings that I had to have. I wouldn't eat it without dressing, and it had to be one of those 3. Gotcha. And then on certain days, I just wasn't into it at all. For
sure. No, I hear you there. What did you want to be growing up? Like, what was aspirations?
I wanted to be an architect, actually. I was always interested in design. I mean, I wasn't like a super artist, but I actually, from the age of 11, I had a mini drafting table in my bedroom, and I I still have them, hundreds of floor plans and elevations of houses. And that was my like hobby or thing that I did. And so I went all the way through university, studying architecture and urban studies. That's what my degree's in. And I intended to go to graduate school in architecture. And I applied and I got in. And I decided to take a year off before going and just kind of make sure. And I worked for a developer in Washington, D.C., who was a specialist in affordable housing. Mm. And in working for her, I realized that a lot of architects work at the behest of a developer. It's the developer who's saying, I want this style, I'm going to plan it this way. Mm. And until you get to like the Frank Gehry, IM pay level, and you have to have that level of talent. And that just really changed my view of like the people who are happy as architects can't imagine doing anything else. And I could imagine doing other things.
Oh, okay. And so I guess, how did you get into this world of Hollywood and becoming a talent agent? How did that happen?
Well, that's interesting because it was through the same person. So this woman who was amazing is called Marilyn Melkonian. She's still working and she runs a company called Telesis Corporation. And she's developed hundreds of units of affordable housing and was very involved in desegregation settlements. And so it was fascinating and I really enjoyed it. But she'd worked for Lucasfilms on like a sort of fluke for a short term. And so while I worked for her, I got to know a couple of people. And then at the same time, where I grew up in Kansas City, there's a group of people who work in Hollywood and I knew them. And it just kind of one thing led to another. And I decided that I was going to go to business school for graduate school instead of architecture school. And wouldn't I like to do that in California, where it's much warmer than Washington in the winter? Mm-hmm. And if I moved there, got in-state tuition for graduate school, for 2 years, I could just like check out Hollywood and have a good time. And then I go to business school and go back into real estate development or something like that. So, and that's basically from her and then this other family friend from Kansas City who was like, oh, you should do it. I'll introduce you to people. You'll get a job. Don't worry. You should just try it. And I did. That's
amazing. Break it down for me. You essentially find talent to star in certain films. Like, so they'll hire you to say, hey, this is what we're looking for. How does that work?
Well, so I never did. So it's a little bit confusing because the blanket term is a talent agent and anybody who does creative things can be talent.
Right.
But in Hollywood parlance, a talent agent represents actors and actresses, mm-hmm. and a literary agent represents writers, filmmakers. Then there's voiceover agents, there's below the line agents. And the training is mostly the same in the sense that you apprentice with someone who has that specialty. And that's basically still the way it's done. You train under someone who already knows how to do it. Mm-hmm. There are a number of people that have law degrees who then do this, but you don't really need one. It can be helpful, but it's also an expensive way to do it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, if you're, motivated and you can tolerate the sort of assistant track, which is, long hours, a lot of expectation, sometimes dealing with very difficult people, you can enter the business because there's a very big open door if you can figure out the points of introduction, because they churn through these people. When I was an assistant, the desk next to me, for the time I was there, I was only assistant for 10 months, which is very unusual. There were like 7 people sitting at the desk next to me because they would find it overwhelming or quit or get fired. So, it's not for the faint of heart, for sure.
Okay. Wow. And so, I mean, I guess some of the most memorable people that you've worked with then in this career?
Well, certainly I was very fortunate to meet the director, Christopher Nolan, at a very young age. We were both children. So he's probably the most famous person, particularly on the literary side that I work with, who's not an actor.
Right.
He and I were introduced. I think I was already a junior agent, had just been promoted, and he had moved to LA and he had done his basically, I think, thesis film, but he and his now wife, they weren't married at the time, but then girlfriend, had shot this movie called Following in college on, I think, Super 8. And it was in black and white. And that was his calling card. And I think I saw that even before I read the first draft of Memento. But I mean, I think I can take credit for selling Memento. The reality was it was pre-sold in that his friend Aaron Ryder, who's now a very veteran producer, had already decided and figured out a way to get it made for Chris. So they auditioned me. I passed the test, started representing Chris, was ready to like send this, super complex, never before seen script out, thinking, oh my God, no one's going to understand it, but boy, do I love it. And then the next day they're like, oh, Newmarket Capital is going to call you and make an offer. I'm like, what? And the rest is history.
Amazing. It seems like, obviously, you have to have a lot of passion to do what you do, because if there's a project or something coming your way, you have to really, really love it to convince other people to love it, right?
No, and that's a huge thing that happens, is that your ability to convey excitement, particularly genuine excitement, and know the ins and outs of what you're selling makes a big difference. People sense that. They can tell whether you're taking something out because it's an obligation versus something that you believe in. And I've been exceptionally lucky in my career where I've not, because sometimes you do have a job or a role where you are in a position where you need to do that because you're beholden to someone else who's more senior than you, who's saying this needs to get done. And that, I would say, is more common. I've been lucky in my past that I kind of chose by accident, that I've generally only been representing things that I love and don't, I've been my own boss a lot. Even when I worked at this first agency, the way it was structured, it was a very flat structure. So, yeah, I mean, that's a longer story, but that's definitely true.
Autonomy, I mean, I don't think everybody is as lucky as you to be able to have a career where like that. You were picking projects that were passion projects, things that really meant a lot to you. And you're right. It makes a huge difference. If you're selling something and you're selling it with your heart and your soul, people pick up on that in a heartbeat.
Well, and I always joke to people that I sell, when people are trying to get their head around what does an agent or a manager in Hollywood do, and I jokingly always say I sell really expensive things that nobody needs. But I think that speaks to what you're talking about, is if that is indeed what you're selling, you have to really believe in it, and you have to be willing to take 100 no's and 100 silly reactions and keep going. And again, like I said, that's not for the faint of heart. You have to have that, not just creative passion, but belief in your clients. You need to represent people that you really believe in their talent.
Mm-hmm. I love that you said you have to hear a lot of no's, because after a while it can weigh on you a little bit when you're hearing no all the time. And then when you get that yes, it's just, to me, it's like that, then this one was meant to be. This project was meant to be. Or if I'm getting no's on all of these requests for podcast interviews and I get a yes, it's like, I'm supposed to interview this person. Awesome. So I love that you said that.
No, I share that, meant to be thing. But I always say too, like, Hollywood is one of these jobs that on a great day, when it goes well, when you get a yes, it's like amazing high. And then when on the regular days or the bad days, when you get a no or a project falls apart, you're like, what am I doing? Yeah. There are so much easier ways to make a living. So, but that kind of roller coaster is quite addictive though too, because the highs are so thrilling. And there's also this, it's a hard business, because even when you get your first yes, there's like 7 more mountains and 7 more yeses you need before something gets to a screen. And even when it gets to a screen, then you have to get the audience to see it. Then you have to get the audience that sees it at first to like it. So there are so many kind of constant hurdles that, it is very daunting. It's emotionally draining at times, because even when you're winning, there's still a potential, even more than a hurdle, like wave to knock you down that could come.
Sure. Andre DeShields, one of his cardinal rules of longevity was, I may butcher it, but he essentially said, the top of a mountain is really the bottom of the next mountain. So keep climbing. And I love that idea that if it is something that's super passionate for you, keep going.
No, I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
He's a wonderful actor.
He is. Yeah. He said that was, I think, an acceptance speech when he won a Tony. And he had 3 cardinal rules, and I wrote them down. I looked them up and I wrote them down because I loved them so much. But yeah, I just love that idea of keep climbing. Let's talk about Julia Child and your connection. I read somewhere when I was looking you up, stalking you on the internet, you met her, right? No?
Yeah, I knew Julia personally. I mean, we weren't best friends, but I mean, I have quite a close connection to her, maybe sort of 1 degree removed. So my mother-in-law, who's a food writer called Anne Willen, who was also the founder of La Varenne Cooking School in Paris, they were very close friends. Okay. And Anne was about 20 years younger than Julia. So they were peers, but there was a mentor-mentee, mother-daughter element to it. And, Julia and Paul were original investors in La Varenne, and Julia really promoted Anne's career. So they were, certainly for Anne, they were lifelong friends. And then it coincided that my partner, Emma, and I had moved to Los Angeles, and Julia was in Santa Barbara. And now that I know so much more about Julia and her life, I think this is so ironic. But Anne, said to us, "Oh, Julia's lonely in Santa Barbara. Will you and Emma go up and see her?" And of course, Julia was never, I think, lonely and always had people around her. But Julia had a close connection with my wife because Anne met Julia in Boston in 1972 when she was pregnant with my wife. And so my wife was born in Boston, even though she hardly ever lived there, and then later went to boarding school in Massachusetts. So she grew up with Julia in her life, and she grew up as someone that, Julia was kind of an auntie to.
Sure.
So that was it was a very, in that sense, a close connection via osmosis. But Em and I used to go up from LA when I was a film agent to visit Julia and, just hang, not all the time. I don't know, once every few months we would go up and see her and have lunch and chat to her and stuff like that.
That's amazing. I've been reading, I read her, I think it's the autobiography I've read, but she seemed like larger than life.
Oh yeah. I mean, Julia is one of those people. I mean, this maybe seems like a strange comparison, and I don't think I've met him in person, but the way that Bill Clinton just has this aura that just exudes warmth and you just feel their presence. Julia was like that. Like, she always made a point. I mean, I remember the first time I met her in person, we had driven up from our apartment in LA, and she was living in this retirement community in Santa Barbara. And she opened the door, and I'm like, oh my God, that's Julia Child in the flesh. And she was quite elderly at this point. And she's like, oh, hello, Todd. I've heard so much about you. It's nice to meet you. And I'm just thinking, Julia Child knows my name? And Emma's later, like, this is more, my wife is like, oh, Stephanie Hirsch was her longtime assistant. She's like, Stephanie told her your name just before you came in. But actually, I don't necessarily think that's true. So many people have that story. And Julia had just a genuine interest in everybody. She loved people and was, and I think that's what came through in television. She just had this tremendous ability to connect with people. And it was genuine, I think. It wasn't an act. It wasn't even something she had to teach herself to be famous. It was just a wonderfully innate quality that was her.
Yeah, for sure. How did the gig at the foundation go? Tell me that story. And I'm referring to your role as executive director for the Julia Child Foundation.
No, absolutely. So I was living in Los Angeles for the second go round after I'd gone to business school in London and had worked in advertising for 5 years. And I just a few years before returned to Hollywood to be a manager and go back to being a creative person and working with clients and trying to be a producer. but I was started my own shingle from nothing after a 5-year hiatus. So that is, no one should do that. It is terrible advice. So it is not a model for anything, but it is what happened. And I was, fortunate enough that I could do that. But so back to the connection. So my mother-in-law, Anne, when she ran the Paris cooking school, there was a period of time where she had to move back to the States. And she hired, I think, someone who'd been a trainee at the school to run it, a woman named Susie Davidson. So Susie had this close connection with my in-laws. Later down the road, and I think through that connection, Susie had met Julia and had worked for Julia for several years and quite far in the past. But as a result, after Julia died, and Susie, she's in the documentary that's coming out. Susie, in turn, because of that, I think had maintained a close relationship with Julia even when she didn't work with her anymore. After Julia died and the foundation was started, because Julia created the foundation. It was her master plan. It was established in 94, I think that's right. But she died in 2004 and it became operational in 2006. But it was based on something she mapped out. And Susie was the first director of it. And I think she was brought in to do that because of her close relationship and knowledge of Julia. And so in 2011, Susie had been doing it kind of part-time while she had a full-time other job. And she was finding it was becoming more and more demanding, especially after 2007 when the Julie and Julia movie came out, because that really kind of supercharged Julia's legacy and reminded everybody of it. Right. And, certainly Meryl Streep can do that. And from that, there was a plan afoot for 2012, which would have been her 100th birthday, that her publisher, Knopf, was planning a sort of centennial event called the JC 100. And Susie felt like that was going to further supercharge things. And there were a lot of things to deal with and that she wanted some help. And so she rung me up and said, hey, do you know anyone who can do this? And I was like, well, actually, Susie, bizarrely, I have all these disparate things I've done that were bad ideas, were not a good, safe career track, all come together in what you need. And there are not that many people who've worked in Hollywood, knew Julia, worked with book publishing, know the food world and cookbooks, and worked in advertising and marketing and PR. So I'd love to help you, but we've just decided to move to London. And so I don't, obviously I don't think you want someone in London. So I'll ask around. And Susie was sort of like, not so fast, Todd. She's like, we run the foundation remotely. And while it's headquartered in Santa Barbara, I work, at the time she was living in Arizona and her assistant was living in New Jersey. The trustees were all in different places. She's like, we're already virtual. What if we just bring you on as a consultant and we'll see how it goes? And that was 2012. And so I moved, and I had no idea that Susie's game plan, although she still claims it was not in her mind, was to retire. So within a year or so, maybe it was 2, I can't quite remember, she wanted to step down and, recommended that I replace her. So that's how I ended up with the job.
That's awesome. I mean, just when you were describing that, it sounds like you were the perfect person actually for that job.
Yeah, I mean, I might be stuck with it forever because it's a really unique combination of skills. I think we're moving to a point where it's getting harder and harder to have people who had a really personal relationship with Julia. But at the time that I joined, everybody involved with the foundation did. Mm-hmm. And, we tried to maintain that as much as we can, although we're cognizant that over time that becomes harder and harder unless either maybe practical or warranted. But I think more importantly, I think you could easily do the job if you have the combination of marketing skills that I have and intellectual property. Those are the two things that really come into play in running the foundation. Mm-hmm. And I think probably having gone to business school also was helpful in terms of just having a little bit more of a skill set and basis to run a very small organization.
Sure. Does it seem like, to me, it seems like Julia Child has kind of exploded in the last few years. I just feel like I don't know if more people are learning about her. I mean, does it seem like that to you? Or maybe it's just me that I'm more interested in her?
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that because that's certainly one of the purposes of the foundation. So if that
Yay.
is true, then yeah, we've been doing our job. So thank you very much. Job done. Yay. I'll pat myself on the back.
As you should.
I think, there's been a proactive effort. The trustees decided years ago, because Julia gave them a lot of freedom, she put all of her assets in this foundation. But then she said her goal with the foundation was to support gastronomy and the culinary arts. So she wanted, after her death, all the things that she advocated for to make the food world a more professional, a more developed, a more delicious, a more sustainable place to carry on. She didn't see it through a personal lens, and she, had really no lasting idea of how much her story would have meaning and resonance for future generations. But she foresaw all of that. And so but they go hand in hand, right? So for us to, have, the foundation is funded by royalties from her work. So they need to keep selling for us to have, because we're not a fundraising organization, it's a private charity. And so one way to do that is to continue to make her legacy and her story, and thus her work, relevant to existing audiences and new audiences.
Mm-hmm. And through the foundation, do you get to, obviously, you pick and choose essentially who you are giving back to and supporting?
Yeah, we have we give about $250,000 in grants away annually, which is really fun. I think there's nothing better than giving worthwhile organizations money.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool.
But we have criteria through the way the foundation is structured. We have to give the money to a nonprofit, so it has to be a 501c3. And then through our own set of interpreting Julia's wishes, we only give money to things in the fields of gastronomy and the culinary arts. So while hunger is often connected, or hunger relief, to the food world and food charities like No Kid Hungry, that isn't our mission. And we've realized that the kind of things that we support in the development of, whether it's professional training to be a chef or to be a food writer or to research culinary history or food media that is based in something substantive, there are very few organizations that do that. And we're not 100% sure because we can't do an audit, but we're not aware of another one that does what we do. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, we feel quite strongly of sticking to this lane, because if we're not doing it, we're not sure what happens. And if you permit me, I'll give you one example that I'm really proud of and thrilled about. We were approached by a quarterly publication called the Oxford American, which originally the Oxford name comes from the University of Mississippi in Oxford, but it's not affiliated anymore. And they call themselves the New Yorker of the South. It's essentially a literary publication. It's pretty highbrow. It's got lots of words in it, and they cover everything, arts, culture, they have a famed music issue. And I don't think they always have it, but they do food issues, and they've always had a food related column. And they approached, and they're a nonprofit. So they sell advertising in the magazine, and you can get a subscription, but they're still a nonprofit. And they approached us to fund food writing. And, our grants are not huge. I would say our average grant is $10,000. And, but they have produced just amazing work with not a lot of money, both in terms of writing and particularly these videos that they're like short films about Southern food and Southern foodways that have been made by a really amazingly diverse set of filmmakers. And I encourage you, it's oxfordamerican.org. You can watch them. They're terrific. And we're so pleased and amazed to see what that's been able to produce and contribute to the dialogue and conversation in food media.
How awesome.
Yeah, it's very gratifying for sure.
I'm sure. I just want to check one thing really quick. But I wanted to say how great that, like you said, giving away money to these organizations.
So fun.
Right? I mean, that's incredible. You also host the podcast Inside Julia's Kitchen.
I do.
How fun.
It is fun. I mean, the best part about it is to just dream up like, who do we want to talk to? And, as you know, it gives you this platform to make overtures. And, I love the introductions we've been able to do. And it's been a great learning experience, too. I certainly was not born a podcaster and had never thought about doing it. And it really came about as an additional way to raise awareness, both for what the foundation is and what we do, but also the idea behind it is called Inside Julia's Kitchen. It's on Heritage Radio Network, and you can find it wherever podcasts are distributed. It's also on our website on juliachildfoundation.org. But we've really found that it just creates this great way to extend Julia's legacy. Like, that's the concept, which is, what did Julia do? Well, she brought all kinds of amazing people into her kitchen, and she told everybody else about it. So that's what we do, except by a podcast.
Yeah.
No kitchen involved.
Right. And then everybody shares a Julia moment, right?
They do. I think originally we were also trying to, talk about Julia's legacy. And I think we just realized so many people have a Julia story or a connection to Julia. And that's always been a favorite thing that people both want to share and tell and have. And, we tried it out at the beginning to be like, well, we'll try it and see what it works. And then, the feedback was always like, oh, that's my favorite part. And our episodes where we do now we're doing these birthday recap episodes where we pick the ones that we thought were either most touching or most surprising or most impactful, and we assemble them. And those episodes, even though they're essentially a rerun, because we've already had them in one episode, but they're at the end, so I think sometimes they may get overlooked or lost if someone doesn't end up listening to the whole thing. So we bring them back, and those episodes are very popular.
How fun. Is there any Julia moment that sticks out to you that someone has shared with you?
Yeah, I have to say the most moving one that was also the most surprising was actually connected to Oxford American. Was they had their last food issue was guest edited by a writer called Alice Randall, who's also a professor at Vanderbilt. And Alice, we had her on because she'd edited the food issue and to talk about it. And this was very much in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's death. It was very close proximity to that. So it was spring of last year, I think. No, where are we? Must be spring of this year. Was when the issue came out. And her Julia moment was, I just had no idea that she basically had met Julia as a student in Cambridge and when she went to Harvard. And Julia she called Julia up and asked her to supervise an independent study project that she was doing. And Julia agreed to have this young Black woman, be mentored essentially by her. They had no affiliation. Julia had no reason to do it. There was no society introduction. And this had just been incredibly meaningful to Alice. And I thought the most powerful thing Alice said, there were a lot of things she said, so it's a rather long one, and you can listen to it, was that Julia told her she could be a writer. And Julia gave her permission to pursue what, to her, particularly as a young African-American woman, was not something other people were just saying, oh, yeah, sure, you can do it. Why not? And that having someone of Julia's stature tell her that that was possible, give her permission, endorse her, was incredibly meaningful. And the fact that she's gone on to be a celebrated writer, and now her daughter is a celebrated writer and poet. Her daughter's called Caroline Randall Williams. It was just amazing to be like that Julia had a connection to that. And I'll give you another example. It wasn't the best Julia moment, but we had the barbecue chef and restaurateur Rodney Scott on because he had a new book out and he's become very successful down, particularly in Alabama and Georgia. And the first thought was like, oh, well, I don't know if Rodney, who, grew up as a poor kid in a very small rural town and was cooking in the pit at 11, would have a Julia Child connection. I'm like, okay, well, you don't have your Julia moment doesn't have to be about when I met Julia. It can even be about someone else who inspired you in your career. So I was all prepared for that. But when I sat down and did the research, actually, everybody has a Julia connection because the writer John T. Edge, who wrote for the Oxford American, who also was one of the founders of the Southern Foodways Alliance, he was the one who first wrote about Scott's barbecue and drew attention to it in the New York Times. And of course, John T. Edge was encouraged to start the Southern Foodways Alliance or pursue it by Julia Child. So from Rodney Scott to John T. Edge to Julia Child was an absolute direct line.
Man, it's the 7 degrees of Julia Child.
Exactly. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, I have a connection with her, I feel like, just based on my research of her. She's taught me things through the things that she said and watching her on TV and reading about. I had a moment with Sarah Moulton, actually. In the book, Julia basically said, she messed up on something. And the bottom line was never apologize, never explain.
Yeah.
And that hit me. And I asked Sarah Moulton her best advice, which is one of my final 3 questions. And she said that was it. Never apologize, never explain. And it's actually in her kitchen. And I just love that. That's my connection with my idol, this woman that I've never met before. But I love that you didn't necessarily have to meet her to have that moment.
No, exactly. That's your Julia moment. And I think that's what has made her legacy so powerful, is that she could connect and teach through all these things she said and advised. And, we're very happy we worked with Knopf to put a compendium of her quotes, and actually the first official compendium of her quotes that includes things like that, because I think people have realized how much wit and witticism Julia offered. And she usually offered that in interviews. It doesn't exist within the context of the shows. It was things she said when she made public appearances. Sometimes it was things she wrote, but she was just very wise. And I think the other thing that you really bring up about never apologize, it's probably a good advice in general, but it's such a simple phrase, but it's so empowering. And I think it's particularly empowering to women who are prone to apologizing just because they've been brought up to be polite. And, I find myself particularly living in the British apologize for literally everything. And so to remind yourself that, no, you should be apologizing when it's necessary you've done something wrong, but not for everything. And so I think there's all these things about Julia's advice that just are loaded with empowerment messages.
For sure. Yeah, I love that. I was about to say preach, because women do apologize for everything. I will start an email with the words, "I'm sorry to bother you, but," and I've had to stop doing that. It's so ridiculous, but you're right. We apologize a lot.
No, and I do it, I do think women tend to do it more and men do it a lot less or feel less inclined, but I find I'm doing it too. I'm like, wait, no, look at your this is advice to everyone. Look at your email. If you're saying sorry, ask yourself, are you sorry?
Yeah.
And why should you be sorry?
What are you sorry for? Exactly. I do have people who love to eat are always the best people. Right. It's right there next to all my cookbooks. So that's my inspiration.
No, I mean, that's the title of the book of quotes for sure, and for good reason. I mean, it's a little bit clubby in the sense that there's a certain, exclusionary thing. My parents haven't been offended by that, but I don't think they would be, I think they're the best people, but they're probably not part of that club. But I think, it says a lot about people who are interested in food and wine and other beverages and things. They have a certain affinity for one another and they have a great time together. It's a good club to join.
I agree. I'm in the club, and those are the people I gravitate towards, I find.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, Todd, I'm going to wrap up a little bit. I do want to say subscribe to Inside Julia's Kitchen on your favorite podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. And then also the website, right? You can find a link to the website on the website.
Yeah, on juliachildfoundation.com, there's a podcast navigation, and you can actually listen to episodes there. You can listen to them on Heritage Radio Network. It's heritageradionetwork.org, but it's available. It's easy to find on Apple or Stitcher or Spotify.
Beautiful. Well, we made
Please
it
do.
about.
We'd love to have you listen.
Yes, absolutely. We made it about 45 minutes before my dog started barking. So that's not bad. Not bad at all. We're going to wrap up a little bit and get to the final three. But I do want to say, keep up the good work, man. I love what you guys are doing. The foundation. It's just amazing. It's incredible.
Well, thank you. It's definitely a very fun job.
I bet.
In that, yeah, it's a pleasure to do, and I enjoy doing it for sure.
Oh, I can tell. I can absolutely tell. Okay, final three. Best advice you've ever been given.
Okay, I have written these down because I want to do it well. Julia always said, prepare, and then you let it go. But, I think people thought Julia did everything off the cuff a lot, and she absolutely did not. She was a super thorough preparer. But what made her a great presenter was she was prepared for what she prepared, not to work out and to pivot. But I think you can pivot a lot better on the fly if you have prepared. And that's a great lesson from Julia.
Wow. I didn't even, I knew the prepare part, but the let it go. That's the key, right?
That's the key, yeah. And it's a hard one, especially if you're like quite organized and A-type. You're like, no, this is not what I meant to do. But that was almost like Julia's secret was she was very prepared, but she knew how to just be like, oh, well, we're going this way now.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay. So
that's good.
The best advice I was ever given did not come from Julia, and I can't even remember the name of the person that gave it to me. But it does relate, and so I'm glad we talked about me being an agent and a manager because it involves deal making. And the best advice I was ever given was never make an offer you're not embarrassed to make.
Ooh, okay. That's good.
Deliberate double negative.
Deliberate and double negative.
And so what it means is if you're in a negotiation for whatever, buying a house, trying to barter with somebody for someone or going for a job or making a contract, if you're trying to say, oh, do I ask for $100 or $200? And if you're like, I'm just going to ask for $100 because that seems reasonable, that means you're not asking for enough. Because if you're really comfortable with your offer, then you're probably undervaluing it. And the same goes in reverse. If you're offered something and you're like, oh, yeah, sure, you probably should rethink it and be like, that's probably not enough if I'm totally fine with it.
That's good
advice. But that also talks about situations when you have imperfect information. So I've done a lot of negotiating in my career, and usually you're dealing with imperfect information. You don't know how much the other side really has to offer. You don't know how much they have to give. And you really have to look at, negotiating to me is all about leverage. And the more leverage you have, the more bold you can be. So it still needs to be relative.
Yeah.
But in general, if you're really comfortable with what you've just written in an email, you probably should rethink that and stretch a little bit further. The worst that can happen is you get a no and you go back to something.
You get a no and you move on. Different path for sure. Okay, Todd Shulkin, what's your happy place?
The beach. I love the beach.
Any particular beach or just the beach?
Well, I love being on the beach in California. My parents go to the Yucatan in Mexico. Those beaches are beautiful. I actually like the Outer Banks too. There's just something really peaceful, and the water's always in the summer the right temperature. So, but I'm not that picky.
Right. Yeah. I grew up in South Carolina, so we were big fans of Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head and all that. And now I live in Oregon, and the Oregon coast may just be one of the most beautiful places to me. So I feel you there.
Yeah.
Okay. In all things food and drink, what do you crave, sir?
So I have actually in the cravings, and what I really like is really embarrassingly pedestrian.
I love it.
It's not, I really like Philly cream cheese, like the original, not the stuff that comes in this silver foil bar. Like I can eat that plain. I connected to that a good bagel and lox with all the trimmings, delicious. And I love pizza, pretty much any kind is I'll go. I mean, you know, I can be a connoisseur of pizza and have my favorite local place that's like slow food and stuff. But, you know, I'll eat a frozen pizza too with the right toppings.
Amen.
And then I can't let it go because back to the beginning. Certainly, Kansas City barbecue is a favorite.
Awesome.
Not that I can get it in Alaska.
Right. Yeah. I grew up with South Carolina barbecue, so yeah.
And I am sure we'd never convince each other that ours is better, right?
Is because at Carolina barbecue, ours was vinegar based. The sauce was vinegar based. Kansas is.
It's tomato based.
Tomato based. Okay.
It's sweeter, and it's definitely not vinegar based.
Right.
And Rodney Scott is from South Carolina, isn't he?
Yes. So I actually wrote his name down because I'm going to do a little bit more research on Rodney Scott. But when my grandmother would make the barbecue sauce, the hogs out back, you know, barbecuing, she would make the barbecue sauce. The entire house would smell like vinegar to the point where you would walk in and it's, you know, pungent. It's very, very vinegary. So.
No, actually, I think South Carolina barbecue in Kansas City is really different. Also, because in Kansas City is not a very pork-based diet; it's very beef-based. So, like the key, like my favorite place in the world that I grew up is Arthur Bryant's in downtown Kansas City, or east of downtown. And to me, their best thing is their burnt ends and their brisket that they do. The burnt ends are the best, and their sauce. It's not particularly sweet, but it is on the sweeter side and is tomato based, I'm pretty sure.
Awesome. And then the drink side, after a long day, is it wine? Is it a margarita? Is it chocolate milk?
Definitely not chocolate milk. Well, living in London, I drink a lot of tea in the evenings, but I definitely, you know, love wine, and I like beer too. I'm not one of those people who has like one drink or the one thing. I'm quite versatile. But during the pandemic, I'll give a shout out to David Levivitz's book, Drinking French, which I had him on the podcast on Inside Julia's Kitchen, and I'd gotten just a preview copy of his book, but then I ordered the real thing because I just thought it was such a fantastic combination of great drink recipes as well as like the backstory on like what is vermouth and where does it come from and how was it invented. And the other interesting thing that I never knew or thought about is drinks in France are very connected to America, because a lot of what is in a bar, even that are French things, goes back to certain things that happened during World War II to help soldiers and stuff. It seems like you know that, and I didn't know that. And so it provides us also unique Franco-American kind of linkage that I just had never thought about. So
I actually wasn't aware of that. So that's pretty cool.
I like a good cocktail. So.
Same. Yeah. I enjoy a good cocktail with ingredients that I've never heard before.
Well, you should. One of the things David introduced is Suze, which is a liqueur that I'd never heard of, which is sort of citrusy, and but it goes well. It's not really. I don't love it on its own, but it kind of adds something to a gin and tonic. And there's also something called Lillet, and just the amount of, you know, obscure liqueurs that you could rediscover as, you know. I like a Kir Royale too.
Oh yeah. Have you heard of China China?
No.
Okay. Yeah, it's a liqueur and one of my favorite cocktails. Super herbaceous, orangey, like a digestive kind of, you know, aperitif. It's really, really good. I'm probably butchering the description of it, but China China, it's quite tasty.
I'll check it out.
You have been so much fun. Thank you for your time today, chatting with me. And I encourage everyone to just check out the work that the Julia Child Foundation is doing. You guys are doing incredibly important work in the culinary world. And it definitely doesn't go unnoticed with me, but also check out the podcast Inside Julia's Kitchen one more time. Subscribe to it on your favorite podcast platform. Todd Schulkin, you have been a blast, and I'm just excited I was very excited to hear your connection to Julia Child, and I really do appreciate all the work the foundation's doing.
Well, Trish, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me to come on and talk.
You've been listening to Hungry for More, an Epicurean's Dilemma with me, Trish Close. You can watch this podcast and subscribe on my YouTube channel. Just search Hungry for More and Epicurean's Dilemma. You can also listen and subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts.